The Dialogue with Clement Manyathela.
It's not just another roundtable discussion.
Let's walk the talk on 702.
So what are we dialoguing about today? I want us to discuss the woke movement, because there's a conversation I've been having with my friends about the movement and where it finds itself, where it's going, and I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are. Do you think that the woke movement is dead? Or do you think that we're transitioning as a society to a post-woke era? And what does that mean? Is it simply perhaps changing its form? Because there are people who believe that wokeness at some point became divisive on different issues, whether it's land, whether it's cultural identity, whether it's decolonization, the Me Too movement. And some may describe our peak of wokeness, or the peak of this wokeness movement, in movements such as like the Fees Must Fall or Roads Must Fall, because those were catalysts for important change, or as moments when wokeness tipped into moral rigidity, right? And I wonder whether that is what has sort of damaged, if you will, the credibility of the movement, this moral rigidity. Remember the call-outs, the cancel culture. How much damage did those have on the woke movement? There were people who at some point were trying to find problematic aspects in this movement, and some of them were branded as people who were against social justice and inclusion, and yet they argued that they were simply against moral policing or performative activism. Because if we are being honest, the movement, you could argue, was exploited to an extent and weaponized to an extent. So what are your thoughts? I think a growing body of research and public opinion data suggests that the momentum for certain types of woke discourse and institutions may be slowing or shifting. That's what I think. While support for many of the values tied to wokeness, like equality, inclusion, diversity, remains quite substantial. In fact, it was Chimamanda Adichie who once wrote that we have a generation of young people on social media who are so terrified of having the wrong opinions that they have robbed themselves of the opportunity to think and learn and to grow. And I wonder if you agree with that statement, because I think to an extent that is a reality for some people. So let me know what you think. Do you think wokeness seems to have sort of new defenders? Is it changing? Is it dying? Is wokeness slowly dying, or has it become more contested? You can give us a call to share your thoughts on 011-883-0702. The WhatsApp line is 072-702-1702. I've got Jamie Mighty, who's a social commentator, joining us for this conversation. We've got Gabaza Tiba, also a social commentator. We're also joined by Zulaikha Patel, who is an activist, a best-selling author and speaker. Gabaza, Zulaikha, Jamie, thank you so much for making time for us. And Jamie, let me just start with you, just generally what your thoughts are about the woke movement. I actually saw a clip. Part of the reason why I wanted to have this chat is I saw a clip on social media. It was doing the rounds, and it's of this woman who was in a gym in America, and in that gym there is someone who is transgender. I think they're still transitioning. I hope I'm describing that correctly. And this woman then sees this person who's transitioning, and then who still has male genitals, right? And this woman then freaks out and goes out and says, "How dare you? This is unacceptable." And there's some, anchors in the US who came out and said, well, I would also freak out if I'm in a women's gym, or I'm in the women's changing rooms at the gym, and I see someone with male genitals, whether they're transitioning or not. And that became a subject of debate. But for some reason, there was a difference in how people were debating. People were not calling for these anchors who were supporting that other woman who was freaked out to be cancelled or to be fired from work, or the debate changed. And I thought, this is interesting, because if this was like 4 years ago or 3 years ago, we would be having a completely different conversation, because there are certain groups who hold a view, whether rightly or wrongly, and sometimes when you go against what they believe or what they hold as a view, then you are somehow on the outside, and sometimes you get targeted for that. So, Jamie, let me get your thoughts on the woke movement as we speak now. Do you think it's still firmly entrenched as it was? Is it dying? Is it taking a new form? What are your thoughts? Jamie, can you hear us? All right, I'll come back to Jamie in a moment. I think we may have a problem there with his network. Zulaikha, you can hear us. Good morning.
Good morning. I can hear you, Clement.
Oh, perfect. Thank you for also joining this chat. What are your thoughts on the woke movement and where it finds itself now?
Thank you for having me. So I think it's very important that when dealing with this question, we deal with it from two aspects: locally, what that means in the discourse of our country, and globally, what that means in global discourse, right? So when I think of the movement around being woke or being politically woke, I look back at years like 2015, 2016, and there was a strong push around then, which was also, when you look at our country, FISMAS4 was at the forefront. There were young people at the forefront of activism. I was also part of a movement that was at the forefront of redefining the conversation around race in the country. And at the time, globally in America, there was Black Lives Matter. So there was a different, stronger push around the movement around being politically woke. And it was more driven at that time by young people, Black people globally, particularly young Black women, driving conversations and steering conversations around racial equity globally, decolonization. There was a lot of vocabulary that we were also being introduced to at the time. We're being taught about things around decolonizing our vocabulary, around how we speak about ourselves, how we speak about our autonomy, how we speak about the very same things that in different movements that we are calling for, how we speak about hair. There was a strong global push around the conversations around hair at the time that was being steered by the movement of being politically woke. But I think that over the years, there's been a complete shift, even just with the term around the term being called woke. There's been a complete shift where down the line over the years, it has completely changed, especially with the rise of social media platforms like X, the rise of cancel culture, the influence of cancel culture as well, that it's made people afraid to have an opinion. And it's made so many young people afraid to think critically and have an opinion that may differ from the next person because of the fear of being cancelled, the fear of not sounding woke enough, the fear of not sounding politically correct as well. And so many people have less of an opinion that we've sort of seen from, if we just look at just 10 years ago, we've seen the movement sort of slow down. And with it slowing down, we've seen a rise in so many people being afraid to be labeled with the term woke, because after a few years, from 2015, 2016, it took a completely different shift, what that term meant, right? And instead, when you look at the recent year, 2024 and 2025, there's been a rise with Gen Z and a couple of millennials where instead of being called woke, or instead of being called politically woke, that has instead been redefined, that instead the things that people who have always been labeled as woke back then would speak about is go back to being general human rights. Like, you look at 2025, what does it mean to be someone who is on the right side of history, who is on the right side of every political stance or human rights stance in the world.
Yes, and I suppose the difference for me is with the woke movement, it appeared like there's a group that must decide what is the right side. So you can never have a different opinion, or you can never find yourself in a moment where you can also make a mistake even in the view that you have and be teachable in that moment. I'll come back to you in a moment, Zulaikha. Jamie, let me hear your thoughts here. Where do you think the woke movement is now, and what could have led to its, if you really believe it's dead, to its demise?
Morning, Clement. Morning to all the listeners. I think where the woke movement is right now is in a position where there needs to be a reconsideration and a recalibration. So the reason why I say that is because the woke movement has been defined by its opponents and its enemies more effectively than it's been defined by itself. Firstly, by using this label woke, a lot of nuance and detail and theory was lost. And then also at some point, the villainization of that critical race theory by those who used the fact that the label sounded so menacing. It took away a lot of the energy from, the focus from the theoretical concepts that were being discussed and why those particular concepts were necessary to discuss. And perhaps we'll have an opportunity to unpack some of those and show why they still matter and they're still important. Having said all of that, I'm mindful of the French Revolution. If you recall, after the French Revolution, there was this almost desire for a dictator again. And that led to the rise of Napoleon and a few other people who were in that ilk, so to speak. So I think we are at the point now where there was a backlash to, social justice theory, which is what we're actually discussing here. And now there may very well be a recalibration to a better social justice theory and community building. So I don't think all hope is lost, but I think that the fact that the conversation was framed for a very long time by the likes of Ben Shapiro, Tucker Carlson, and those type of characters, the Andrew Tates, all of that, and its reduction to these labels, woke and critical race theory, without a discussion about what are we actually talking about, I think that definitely has damaged. But also, some of the movements did not help. Black Lives Matter was mentioned in passing. I think one of the biggest regrets of the Black Lives Matter movement is that the founders stole a lot of money. And in so doing, they allowed for criticism to come from the right to say, look at these people, they're grifters, they're thieves. And that took away from the attention around police brutality, the, prison industrial complex in America, as well as the rise of these for-profit prisons and how black men are, disproportionately affected by policing in communities.
Yeah. So then the question then is, because there's no disagreement, right, Jamie, that this is a movement that was necessary. I think there was an awakening that came with that movement. There was a lot of consideration, a lot of teaching, a lot of learning that came with that. Zulaikha Patel, we know Zulaikha because she was advocating for black girls to wear their natural hair the way they want to wear them, without also just suppressing that and acclimatizing to the standards of what, of whiteness and what white hair or the expectations are supposed to be. How necessary do you think the movement itself was? And are you worried that as it changes its form, we may get to a point where we lose that awakening?
Well, the movement was very necessary and remains necessary, Clement, because fundamentally, when we're talking about, the reason why stay woke became a buzzword and a catchphrase and this thing that permeated black culture and the community groups which were marginalized, it was stay alert around the inequalities and inequities that exist around you and push back against them until you reach a position of participatory parity. But stay woke, I guess, is a good abbreviation for that, right? But then as it permeated more and more of the broader lexicon, all of that got diluted. So we must remain clear about what are the things that social justice is about, right? It is about trying to get equity and equality for marginalized groups, whether they are minorities or they are majorities. But if they've been marginalized as a result of history or as a result of ideologies or political systems, that is what it's about. So it's about ending, discrimination against queer people, to use just a broad umbrella.
Yeah.
It's about, ending patriarchy. It's about ending the economic injustice that continues to persist in the global order, where the global south is at the bottom of the pyramid and is being extracted for minerals, while wealthy nations can build AI models and, data centers using the cobalt and the coltan and various other minerals from the DRC, and using the gold from Sudan so that people in Dubai can have more jewelry. All of these things are part of social justice. And if we were to analyze the global order right now, can we realistically say, looking at it from the African perspective, that poverty is over for Black people? Can we look at it and say inequality is over? Can we look at it and say that in Africa that queer bodies have got the same recognition as everybody else? Can we look and say that there has been a marginal impact on patriarchy across Africa? I don't think that any of those things can realistically be said to have been ended or defeated or anything to that effect. So the necessity for this particular movement and way of thought continues. But if we move away from the theoretical framework and just use the labels, we often get diluted by the opponents of these ideas, which are still important even in a place like South Africa, where you see the discrepancies between life in the suburbs and life in the rural areas and townships of South Africa.
Yeah. Zulaikha, what do you think were some of the things that affected the movement? I indicated earlier that there is a growing body of research and I suppose public opinion data that suggests that the movement sort of is shifting in a way. But what you cannot mistake that for is the fact that the support for the many values that are tied to this movement are still there. So issues of equality, inclusion, diversity, those still remain substantial. But it's the movement itself and the way it's always been curated is changing. But I'm interested to hear from you what you think of the call-outs and the cancel culture, for instance, and whether you think, because somehow those were somehow linked to the movements. Do you think they damaged the credibility of the woke movement itself? Yes, Zulaikha?
Oh, yes. Sorry, you were breaking slightly. I didn't catch you at the last bit of the question.
I was asking about the call-outs movement and the cancel culture, and whether you think that is, in fact, what also contributed to damaging the credibility of the woke movement. Because people have always seen that when the call-out culture and the cancel culture as sort of the sub elements of the woke movement.
Oh, definitely. I do think that contributed, which is what I mentioned earlier, that there's so many young people in our country that are afraid to have an opinion, because having an opinion, and should that opinion differ from someone else's opinion, now because the woke movement has gone in a totally different direction, where it's given certain individuals the right over others to decide who is politically correct, who is politically incorrect. And it's taken away the freedom that people have to have opinions that may differ, or have an opinion which could be a moment for you to learn, and an opinion which isn't fully informed. People who feel that they're not fully informed on certain subjects prefer to stay silent, remain silent, and not say a single thing because of cancel culture. And cancel culture has in fact become quite damaging beyond just call out culture and calling out someone publicly. It's become so damaging. It's become damaging in terms of reputation. It's become damaging in terms of people being cancelled and not even being allowed to come out and say, look, perhaps I was misinformed, and am I allowed to take this as a learning moment and change? Once you're cancelled in South Africa, and let alone be cancelled on X, it's over for you.
Well, it used to be, I suppose, at some point, but I think people are much more aware now, aware of like, for instance, as I said earlier on, there's no longer like the pressure of, even if someone does call on you to be cancelled, or no, don't talk to this person. People are much awakened now, and they make their own decisions, as opposed to be so scared of, oh, now we can't talk to this person because they're being branded in this particular way. Let's take some WhatsApp voice notes that are coming through on 072-702-1702. I'll take your calls as well on 011-883-0702. Jamie Mighty and Zulaikha Patel are helping us understand where the woke movement finds itself. And I'm interested in your thoughts as well. Let's start with some WhatsApps.
Morning, Clement. I'm really confused. Please, can you help me? I don't at all understand what so-called woke is. As far as I can understand, there are people who are empathetic. There are people who can see that justice needs to be done. There are people who are able to look and see past what the norms have been, to see that things have changed, that things can be different. Why does that mean it's woke? Why does it have to have a label? As soon as you label something, you give others something to attack. That's what I see. So why is there a label to just being aware, fair, and just, as I see it? So what's this woke thing? Makes no sense to me.
All right, I'll get my guests to respond to that if they want. Another message on the WhatsApp line says, hi, Clement. Wokeism weaponizes certain terms and opinions in an attempt to exempt others from accountability or criticism. It doesn't mean that if you criticize women, you are a misogynist, or if you criticize gay people, you are homophobic. Wokeism has classified people who politically would consider themselves center as right, and hence push them to the right. That's Shafiq there on the WhatsApp line. I've got more of your WhatsApps coming through, your calls as well on 011-883-0702. What do you think of the woke movement? There's no doubt, at least in my mind, that it was necessary, but at some point it started shifting. And there are some elements that infiltrated the movement, which then really society began to wake up and open up and say, we are still committed to the ideals of what this movement is advocating for, but the call out and cancel culture is that it's just not happening and working out anymore. It just doesn't make sense for some people, and they started pointing that out, and that is why some people then didn't even want to be associated with the movement. What are your thoughts? Give us a call or send us a WhatsApp voice note. It's 11:30.
The Dialogue with Clement Manyathela.
It's not just another roundtable discussion.
Let's walk the talk on 702.
It's 25 minutes before 12 o'clock. We're having a conversation on our Thursday dialogue this morning about the idea of the woke movement. Do you think that it's dead? Do you think that it's changing? Are we transitioning as a society to a post-woke era? There are people who do not want an association with the movement, but they say their support for many of the values tied to wokeness, whether it's equality, whether it's inclusion, diversity, those remain substantial for them. What are the lessons also from the woke movement? What have you picked up as things we can learn from as we transition as a society? Give us a call on 011-883-0702. Your WhatsApp's on 072-702-1702. Let's start with calls. Haupalelwi, you're calling us from Rosebank. Good morning.
Hi, Clement. Hi, it's Khao.
Hey, Khao.
Hey, my friend. Listen, as a proud 1K and fellow member of the woke movement, I'm struggling to think of wokeness as a movement, but rather as a term we used during the time that we were championing your fees must fall and feminism and so on. And I don't think that is dying. I think we're still socially conscious, but I think we need to think about it in the context of a generation. That generation, we are now parents. We are now in institutions and in organizations where we are still trying to push the same ideals we had when we were still students, when we were still younger. And I think the term in itself was just used to mean, awake. I think the young people of today, Boma 2K, are taking on the bait. And I mean, we all were changing our profile pictures to purple. And I would like to say that as much as Women for Change is led by some 1Ks, I'm using it as an example. There's a lot of 2K activism that came out of that. I mean, I remember I was organizing one of the events and the gathering, and I said to these young people, I said, you know what, I'm going to sit down. I'm not going to say a lot. It's your turn. It's your time to champion these things now. You are taking on the bait. And so I think the woke as a term and the movement in itself, is something that is in the constant context of a generation. So I think our generation has stopped calling ourselves woke because we're older, we're more socially conscious, and we are moving on from the term, but we're not moving on from the ideals. And these young people are coming up with new things and new ways of saying things, but with the same literally ideals that they have. That's just my view on it. Yeah.
What do you think are the lessons, how from even as someone who participated directly within, of course, that sort of movement, if you will. What do you think are the lessons from there? Because part of what has been raised as problematic traits of that movement was like the cancel culture, the call-outs. There's no space for people to make mistakes. If someone's tweets somehow appear from 30 years ago, we say, that person must be cancelled, whether they take accountability or not. What do you think are the lessons we must take? Because the movement itself was necessary. That era was necessary, and it opened many people's eyes. It can change its form, but we can take lessons and say, how do we move forward? What are your thoughts?
My thoughts is like what you spoke about. I had to learn a lot myself about what the difference is between calling out and calling in, and what that looks like. But also, I think realizing that this type of movement needs to have its own set of integrity and own set of rules. Like, it can't just be, we do what we want. We need to have our own set of integrity. I don't like the word rules, but we need to also take responsibility in terms of what does it mean to be part of this movement? Are you checking in on yourself? Are you looking at your own biases? I think I had to learn that. But another thing, big one that I had to learn, Clement, and I think that's what separated that woke movement, especially during the Fees Must Fall time, it was the fact that many of the women and the queer community part of the movement felt as if their cries were being sidelined, and we were being told, man, let's get rid of racism first. Let's talk about capitalism first. Your issues will come. I think what I learned from that was the issues matter all at the same time. We can fight patriarchy and racism all at once.
Absolutely. You can walk and chew at the same time. How? Always appreciate your incredible insights. Thank you for calling us from Mulder's Drift. Let me go back to my guests, Zulaikha, and Jamie, and I'll come to more of your WhatsApps and calls as well. Jamie, let me first get your thoughts, if you've got any, from the contributions that have come so far. But my direct question to you is, do you think that the core ideas behind sort of wokeness actually, they've become more mainstream? And are we seeing a shift from the loud, confrontational activism to a more sort of quieter, more integrated forms of social awareness? I mean, what House says, that we were young at the time, we are more adults now, we are more socially conscious. And I wonder if actually that's the new form that it's taking. You're moving away from the loud, confrontational activism to a more quieter, just integrated forms of social awareness. What do you think?
It's an interesting question, Clement, but I would have to say that I don't think that that's where we're going. And I'll try to give you my thinking around why I'm saying that. So I don't think that the core ideas have become mainstream. I think that they've been co-opted, and they've been co-opted in ways that I think are actually harmful to the aims of the people who are bringing up these issues. So for instance, if you look at the diversity, equity and inclusion movement, the DEI, it was taken over by large corporations in a manner that did not necessarily lead to transformation of those corporations in the core sense that people wanted. So at some point, companies started reporting that they were doing, diversity reports and measuring all of this stuff. But when you looked at the metrics, like if you look at Apple computers, they would issue their diversity report every year and say that they were making some progress or small steps towards progress. But when you looked at the composition of the company in terms of the technical staff, in terms of the management, you'll find that Black people, women are still a minority in Apple computers, even disproportionate to the American population, for instance. So that's number one. And that co-opting can be risky. If you look at how corporations took over gay pride or tried to basically use pride to sell their product and to get almost like a virtue signaling position in society without actually doing anything meaningful to helping people who are from the queer community to actually get more equity, more rights. So I think there's been a lot of co-opting, but I also think that we have to be mindful about the moment that we're in right now.
Sorry, Jamie, have the activists themselves also allowed themselves to be co-opted? Because who takes responsibility there? And I hear what you're saying about corporations playing the leading role, co-opting, but there are people there who genuinely have told us they truly and genuinely represents the rights of, let's say, to use your example, the queer community. So do we then place the blame on the big corporations, or do we place the blame on the activists who have claimed to genuinely represent the rights of queer, but as soon as corporates come in, then that begins to shift because there's money on the table?
Yeah, professional activism has always been a very dangerous thing. And I think one of the mistakes was to actually allow for celebrity influencers and people who become activists and take money from corporations and entities, because it's always easy to buy out one person. I think another mistake that was made is that many of the movements were leaderless. And because they were leaderless, there were no political structures in the historical sense of the word to keep things accountable and to keep core values core, if that makes any sense. And part of that came from the frustration with politicians and politics as usual. But the baby was thrown out with the bathwater. You use a movement like Fees Must Fall. There was no structuring, no archiving, no real cementing of the demands. So 2 years or 3 years after the fact, Wits could actually reverse many of the concessions that they had made to students around access to the institutions. And it's almost basically where it was in 2015 when the movement started, and we're now 10 years later. So I think that was some of it, Clement, and I think it caused a great damage. We should never have had those types of things. But so what I would say is the activists who then went and took the money should be looked at in certain ways, particularly where they were justifying and allowing corporations to hijack communities and movements for the purposes of making those corporations look good, not necessarily for the purposes of changing the fundamentals of those structures. Look at Silicon Valley right now. All of them were under DEI, Clement. They were all saying that they believe in this stuff. But if you were to ask Google, Apple, Facebook, any of the FANG companies, and even NVIDIA and these new ones, how diverse are they now in 2025 after Black Lives Matter? Those numbers have barely moved, but they used the last 5 or 6 years to keep branding themselves as doing that. But now the other thing I just wanted to quickly mention is that our political reality right now shows that we still need this type of collectivization. We have an authoritarian world, which is increasingly becoming more authoritarian. We have a manosphere, which is increasingly becoming more toxic. And we've lost some of the core values of Ubuntu, which is why sometimes when people are trying to come together to build intersectional movements, you have some people not recognizing the humanity of other people who are either trying to be allies or trying to support the movement. All of that can lead to harm for the aims and objectives of the movement.
Zulaikha, let me bring you in here with your own thoughts. What do you think of professional activism? Because I think that's part of what sometimes affects even the credibility of, even movements like, the woke movement, because let's say, Jamie used an example of big corporations who get involved in pride, for instance. So there's a questioning we need to do as well on people who are advocates, who are activists, who are okay to be genuine activists, who are pushing for these social issues, rightly so. But as soon as there's money on the table, they're willing to have different conversations because they're human beings who also want to benefit in some way. Is that part of what sometimes affects then these issues that are being advocated for and the movement?
Yes, truly, absolutely. That does affect movements. And I think it also always comes down to the fact that it's a question of morality, and it's a question around individuals and where your moral compass is located. Because at the end of the day, when you ask the question about professional activism and whether it begins to water down movements when people accept money, I'll say it outright that firstly, there is nothing wrong with accepting money. What becomes the problem is where you accept the money, because at the end of the day, the hand that feeds you is the hand that controls you. And so at the end of the day, the problem starts to arise when you are accepting money from co-ops to movements, and then suddenly that changes your activism, and that changes your stance, and that changes where you stand on matters of social justice. And that's where the problem is, because we also have to be frank that changing the world is not something that you can do for free. You need funding. You can't even... Movements need funding. Activists need funding behind their work. We live in a capitalist world where you need money to want to change the world and also bring about any community change. I'm just checking if you can still hear me clearly.
Yeah, we
my
can,
line
Zulaikha.
is breaking.
Yes,
we can.
So, yes, as I'm saying, you need money for community work. You need funding behind that. And so you always have to deal with this question around where is your moral compass as an individual, because it's a very important question around where your moral compass is located as an individual. Because if you are an activist that stands for, I'm going to make an example, that stands for a movement against gender-based violence, and gender-based violence, and you're dealing with gender-based violence in terms of femicide, in terms of, trigger warning rape, in terms of violence against queer individuals, and then you go and accept money from funders that are known to be homophobic, you are going against your movement, and that will instead completely change your movement. And for example, if we look at activists like Malala, for example, certain people align themselves with certain individuals who fund their work, and then it completely changes how they use their voices. So at the end of the day, it boils down to where is your moral compass located as an individual, because there is nothing wrong with wanting to be remunerated for speaking or whatever service that you would offer, and that instead continues to fund the passion for your activism, and that funds your activism work. But the problem comes where it begins to be at a conflict with your moral compass and what you stood for initially.
Got it. Here's some WhatsApp voice notes that have come through on 072-702-1702.
Hi, Clement. I think you're conflating the cancel culture / call-out culture with wokeness. Wokeness has always been around. The Black consciousness movement of the 1960s and 70s, the Pan-Africanist movement in the 50s and onwards, all those movements were anchored around wokeness. What you say put people off is not the wokeness, because you say the concept that wokeness promotes are still there. What has shifted is people's support for people getting cancelled for having different views. But the core of the wokeness, the equality, the decolonization, and all other associated efforts are still there, and I would argue being strongly pursued.
100%.
Hello here from the East End.
Hello, I'm Clement, and hello to all your guests and all the listeners. So, my interpretation of woke is it was never intended to be a movement. It was a verb. It was actually a verb. It was a word that means you are aware and awake to what's happening around you, to people around you. So it became a movement because people started labeling woke people as the woke gang. And it was positive and negative, So in terms of being woke, it's something that will always be there. If you're aware and you are awake to what's happening around you, to what's happening to other people, the things that affect the people in this world, then you're woke. If you have an opinion about what's happening in Israel and Palestine, and you can see the injustices that are happening around the world, then you are woke. It was never a movement, according to my understanding and interpretation.
9 minutes before 12.
The Dialogue with Clement Manyathela.
It's not just another roundtable discussion.
Let's walk the talk on 702.
7 minutes before 12 o'clock, we're wrapping up our conversation around wokeness and is it a movement, is it not? And I take what you're saying. In fact, especially the recent voice notes that came up now around wokeness has always been there. The Black consciousness movement, and maybe this generation took up different social issues or advocated for specific social issues that may have been advocated for before or that we knew, and they brought those into the arena. Jamie, you mentioned something about, because I'm interested in the rise of the new right and Trump's second term and how that has reshaped the public appetite for woke politics.
Yeah, look, I think that what we are seeing now is that we're in the middle of a backlash to the social justice movement broadly, if we are trying to be all-encompassing and avoid a problematic label or a label that has become problematized, even though it was a verb, as was described by the caller. I think if you look at Zohan Mamdani and the discussions around affordability which are happening in New York, you're beginning to see a resurgence in some of the economic thinking around why exactly it was that certain issues were being raised in the manner that they were by, scholars and academics and activists on the ground. So I think we are beginning to see that. But at the same time that we're beginning to see that, we're still very early in the Trump administration. And we are now seeing many manifestations of still people who are trying to unravel any progress that was made in the Obama years and maybe in the Biden years in terms of the pursuit of certain types of social justice. That also applies to the South African context, because you will have right-wing movements such as, AfriForum and Solidarity tapping into the same narratives. And I think we even had one politician writing a book, Go Woke, Go Broke. And so we still see a lot of pushback even locally. So this is not just a conversation which attaches to America. It's one that we see here. We also saw in the UK that march, the Million Man March, which was basically some kind of ultra nationalist, very patriarchal type of a march happening there in London. And if you pay attention to those trends, you look at characters like Elon Musk and look at other people who are dominating the AI space right now, there is a very big pushback. But I think that people on the ground are beginning to appreciate that they need to actually do more to get the ideas which were behind this label woke back into circulation, and to talk more about late capitalism and some of the impacts and the need for redistribution, recognition, and progress that basically we can all put under that label of progressivism, if you will.
Yeah. Oh, Jamie Mighty and Zulaikha Patel, let me thank both of you for making time for us. This was such a lovely conversation. I really enjoyed it. I really appreciate your time. It's 3 minutes before 12.